Thank you very much, James. Your Excellency, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining us at UTS for today's event. Let me also acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whose ancestral lands our city campus now stands on. And also like to pay respect to elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land and of the lands from which all of our online guests are joining us today as well. I'd like to welcome our special guest for today, His Excellency Ambassador Xiao Qian of the People's Republic of China. We thank you for joining us today, and we thank you for sharing your thoughts on the future relationship between our two countries. Today's event is hosted by ACRI, the Australia-China Relations Institute, and as James indicated earlier, ACRI is an independent, non-partisan research institute established by UTS in 2014 to inform the dialogue around the relationship between Australia and China. ACRI is Australia's first and only institute devoted to studying the relationship between Australia and China. ACRI's mission is to inform Australia's engagement with China through research, analysis, dialogue grounded in scholarly rigour and open debate. The Australia-China relationship has traditionally been one of strong economic ties and common bilateral and regional interests. China and Australia hold memberships in numerous organisations, including the East Asia Summit, the G20, APEC. The relationship has grown over the years, with China as Australia's largest trading partner. And while the economic ties between the two countries remain strong, it is evident that in recent years the relationship between the respective governments has deteriorated to probably its lowest point in some time. However, through public events like this one that we are attending today, ACRI aims to continue to support an open and frank dialogue between the two countries, and I would again like to thank Ambassador Xiao for making the time to attend and share his thoughts. Let me now introduce Ambassador Xiao Qian. Ambassador Xiao is the current ambassador to China and has been in office since January of this year. Previously, he served as Chinese ambassador to Indonesia from 2017 to 2021, and prior to that, as Chinese ambassador to Hungary from 2012 to 2015. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Xiao.
Well, what an audience in this beautiful hall. And the morning tea was so fruitful. On one occasion, I've got so many cards. Yeah, a lot of friends, a number of old friends, and most of them are new friends. I'm so happy to be here. And thank you so much for your presence. Professor Andrew Parlett, Vice Chancellor and President of the University of Technology, Sydney, and Professor James Lawrenson, Director of the Australia-China Relations Institute of UTS. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, a good morning to you all. It's indeed my great pleasure to be here for the event. I'd like to...
Stop the genocide. 1 million women in concentration camps. Stop the genocide. Tibet remains colonized. We want freedom for Tibet, freedom for Hong Kong, independence of Hong Kong. Stop platforming murderers. This is a representative of a dictatorship with 1 million Muslims in concentration camps. 1 million Muslims in concentration camps. Uyghur Muslims are being raped and tortured as we speak. We are supporting freedom for Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers. We support freedom for Hong Kong, freedom for Tibet. Free the Uyghurs. Stop the ongoing genocide. Stop the ongoing genocide. This guy is representing a dictatorship that murders and rapes Uyghurs, that commits genocide against Tibetans and Uyghurs. that has the reputation of committing genocide.
You're having enough time.
Those who support this dictatorship are committing genocide.
Just get out. Just get out.
Committing genocide.
Get it out! Get out! You
We should not be deeply traumatized with the dictatorship.
Ladies and gentlemen, UTS welcomes freedom of speech on campus. Let me make that clear. That right, however, does not extend to speaking over the top of invited guests and disrupting members of our audience from today's event. So please bear with us for another 10 seconds, and then we can continue on with that open dialogue that I was emphasising at the beginning of today's event. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Obviously, it's not a easy start.
What a disgrace. How about freedom of speech in China?
Bye.
Disgraceful.
Bye.
Appalling. CCP's a dictatorship.
Well, it's my pleasure here, really, to be here for this event. Although there are different views, and I respect the invitation from the UTS and ACRI. It is upon the invitation from UTS and ACRI that I come here to take this opportunity to exchange views with you. It gives me a platform to share my views, at the same time to listen to your views, through your questions posed in advance. And I think it's a good opportunity that we have different views, but there should be expressed in a way that is appropriate. Well, I'd like to start by expressing my sincere thanks to UTS ACRI for your kind invitation, and to Professor Andrew Park for your kind introduction, and to James and your team for your thoughtful arrangements. I'd also like to express my appreciation of the contribution of UTS made over the years in promoting exchange and cooperation between China and Australia in education, scientific research, and other fields, and of the important role ACRI has played in promoting understanding of China-Australia relations. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I'm glad to be here to exchange views with you on China-Australia relations. In the past 5 months, since I came here as a Chinese ambassador to this great country, I've been visiting different places, meeting with colleagues and friends from different walks of life, from different parts of this country. On China-Australia relations, my message is clear and consistent. Briefly speaking, the past 5 decades have been a successful story of friendly cooperation between China and Australia. And this relationship is mutually beneficial in nature. The recent years of our relationship has been a difficult period, undeniably. Nonetheless, China's policy of friendly cooperation towards Australia remains unchanged. And looking into the future, China-Australia relations enjoy great potential for cooperation and bright prospects. That's the message that I brought with me from China. Not long ago, I published 2 articles in the Australian Financial Review. And during my recent trip to Perth, I addressed the National Conference of Australia-China Friendship Society. On those two occasions, I talked mainly about the past 50 years of our bilateral relations, the great achievement we have made. And I talked about the potential areas of cooperation between our two countries in the long run. So for those of you who may have interest, please visit my embassy website for the details. In the interest of time, today rather, I'd like to focus on the up-to-the-minute state of China-Australia relations and my personal views on what we could do in the immediate future. After the recent federal election, Australia has a new Labour government. It's a choice of the Australian people, and it's a domestic affair of this country. Nonetheless, it has provided with an opportunity of possible improvement of our bilateral relations. Chinese Premier Xiao Qian sent his message of congratulations to Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, and he received a letter of appreciation as a reply. The Defense Minister from China and Australia, as been mentioned by James, held a successful meeting, first meeting ever between the two, a sideline of Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore recently. These communications and the face-to-face contacts are obviously very significant.
Please leave the room. Please leave the room, madam.
We cannot. That's why university cannot platform a representative of a genocidal dictatorship. It's committing genocide in Tibet, in Uzbekistan. No, they still cannot human rights.
Madam, could you please leave the room now? Madam, could you please leave the room?
These communications and the face-to-face contacts are obviously very significant for our bilateral relationship, but equally, perhaps more important is how we can keep the momentum and put our bilateral relationship back on the right track. It's a very thoughtful arrangement. Well, I think I should continue. How should I continue? But more importantly is how we can keep the momentum and put our relationship back on the right track for a sound and a steady development. Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi made a very important remark during his recent trip to the South Pacific, and I quote, "To improve China-Australia relations, there's no autopilot mode. A reset requires concrete actions." My view is there are 5 major areas where it is important, at least in my views, for China and Australia to make joint efforts. First, on the political front, it's important to respect each other. Respect for each other's sovereignty, territorial integrity, political system, and development mode. These are just some of the basic principles for sound and healthy relations between two sovereign states. The world is colorful and diversified. Democracy is applied in different forms in different countries, even among different Western democracies. The socialism with Chinese characteristics in China is the choice of the Chinese people. It is based on the national conditions of China, and it has achieved great success in tremendously improving the livelihood of the 1.4 billion Chinese people. For example, during the past 4 decades of reform and opening up,
Come on. That says to Tibet, to see the truth in Tibet, free Tibet. Cultural genocide for 17 years and nobody is listening.
During the 4 decades of reform and opening up, China's per capita GDP has increased by more than 200 times. 40 years, 200 times. The rural residents' per capita disposal income in China has increased by nearly 120 times. So China and Australia were different in many aspects, but there's no reason that we cannot coexist peacefully when we respect each other. Second, on economic front, it's important to stick to the principle of mutual benefit. The exchanges and cooperation between China and Australia in the past several decades have fully demonstrated that the nature of this relationship is mutually beneficial. It has contributed to China's modernization, especially its industrialization and urbanization process. It has also created a huge trade surplus and considerable job opportunities for Australia, promoting the prosperity of Australia's mining, agriculture, education, tourism, and among other sectors. Australia is the only OECD member that has maintained economic growth for 29 consecutive years, and it has weathered multiple global and regional economic and financial crises. It's fair to say that Australia's cooperation with China is a very important contributor in that respect. The mutually beneficial nature of the cooperation between China and Australia will not only stay in the long run, but also reinforce, in my views. China is implementing the new concept of innovative, coordinated, green, open, and shared development, and is focusing more on the quality and efficiency of its development. The Australian Labor government's emphasis on addressing the issue of climate change is pretty strong. And all these, above others, offer even greater opportunities for China-Australia's cooperation. Of course, to consolidate and expand the mutually beneficial cooperation between our two countries requires favorable atmosphere and favorable policies. Third, on security front, it's important to take an objective and rational view. Essentially, the right to development is the fundamental right of the people of a sovereign state. China is a big country with a nation civilization of over 5,000 years. China used to be at the forefront of the world history for a long, long time. The development achievements of China today come from the unremitting hard work of the Chinese people. Our goal is to change our people's life for the better, not to challenge any country or anyone. The size or strength of a country does not determine the nature of its relations with others. Its policy does. Big and powerful countries could be our friends, but small and weak countries could be our enemies. China pursues an independent foreign policy of peace, adheres to the path of peaceful development. China is committed to building a community with a shared future for mankind, and will always be a positive force for world peace and development. There's a lot of areas where China and Australia share common grounds, and there's no historical agreements or fundamental conflict of interest between us. China's development is an opportunity instead of a so-called threat to Australia. And there's every reason for China and Australia to be friends and partners rather than adversaries or even the so-called enemies. Fourth, on international and regional affairs, it's important to strengthen coordination and cooperation. China is a participant, builder, contributor, and beneficiary of the existing international system. China supports necessary reform and improvements to the international order and system so as to make it more just and equitable. But China does not seek to start a new one. China will firmly uphold the international system with the United Nations at its core, the international order based on international law, the basic norms governing international relations based on the purpose and principles of the UN Charter. China, Australia, we used to be allies during the World War II, and we share the same interest in safeguarding the post-war international order. As important countries in the Asia-Pacific region and open economies, as members of East Asia Cooperation, RCEP, APEC, G20, United Nations, and other UN agencies, China and Australia share a lot of common grounds. We have also been coordinating and cooperating in areas such as counterterrorism, transnational crimes, climate change, disaster relief, UN peacekeeping, among others. Coordination and cooperation between China and Australia in international and regional affairs serve the best interests of our two countries and our two peoples, and is also conducive to the global and the regional peace, stability, and prosperity. Last but not least, it's important to properly handle differences. It should be no surprise to anyone that there exist differences between and among countries, between China and Australia. As I have repeated for several times, there are many areas of common grounds between China and Australia, and these are the areas we can continue to cooperate for the benefits of our two countries and two peoples. There are, undeniably, certain areas where China and Australia have different views, and these are the areas where we should continue to conduct constructive dialogue to minimize the differences if possible, and to enlarge our common grounds if possible. But it's important we should properly handle the differences in such a way that the differences, even disputes, are not going to affect the overall relationship between our two countries, are not going to affect the overall cooperation between our two nations. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, the relations between China and Australia is important to both countries. China has always been viewing our relations with Australia from a strategic and long-term perspective. China's policy of a friendly cooperation towards Australia remains unchanged. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the diplomatic relations between China and Australia. It is hoped that our Australian colleagues, especially this new Liberal government, could join us to make a concerted efforts by moving towards each other, by taking concrete actions, by adhering to the principle of mutual respect and mutual benefit, so as to bring our bilateral relationship back on the right track of development at an early date. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for that address. Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin by giving the Ambassador one more round of applause. Look, I'll go off script a bit. The easiest thing in the world for the Ambassador to have done today would have been to not accept our invitation to attend a public event. He could have stayed in the walls of the Chinese embassy in Canberra comfortably, but he's come today. And I thank you for the respect that you've extended to us, Ambassador, and we'll now move into a period of conversation. Some of the questions not being so simple or easy.
Well, thanks, James, for your warm welcome, for your opening remarks. Yeah, it's a very important occasion, as I said in my speech. It's a mutual communication.
Right.
Yeah, I'm here to share with my views, at the same time listen to your views. And I think it's good to have an open discussion. You know, there's no wrong question. There could be only wrong answers. I'll try to be a bridge as ambassador to link between our two countries, between our two peoples.
I think my own view is that I think the Ambassador, in the public size, I think the fact that you've come here today
will certainly enhance the public's view of you and what you're trying to do here.
Thank you for the encouragement.
All right, let's get started. Look, just a reminder, and I want to be transparent with our audience, the questions that I'm putting to the Ambassador will not come as a surprise to him. I have flagged those with his office beforehand. They included some de-identified questions that the audience submitted during the registration process. I hope we get to as many of those as we can. But can I also be clear that I alone had responsibility for formulating and selecting these questions? And I thank again, Mr. Ambassador, to you for accommodating that request so we could engage in genuine dialogue. It's a shame our friends aren't still with us, because if they hung around, I feel quite confident that after this question and answer session, they too would have agreed that this discussion we're going to have is not just a series of Dorothy Dixer questions. We're going to be delving right into some matters of substance in the debate. Mr. Ambassador, let me get started. Look, I'd like to tackle some challenging issues front on, if I may, in a not-too-distant past. It was in early 2020 that the breakdown in senior political dialogue between Canberra and Beijing began, and when Australia's exports started being disrupted. From that time, the message delivered to the Australian public by the former Morrison government was that Beijing had changed, China had changed, and become hell-bent on punishing Australia simply because Canberra had the temerity to call for an independent international inquiry into the origins and global spread of COVID-19. Well, to be frank, in my assessment, there was a significant change in China's behaviour. I remember prior to 2020 telling people that for all the political fallout since 2017, the fact was ministers on both sides were still meeting and trade continued to flow smoothly. Mr. Ambassador, my guess is that 95% of Australians would consider a call for an independent international inquiry into COVID-19, a devastating global pandemic, to be a fair and reasonable thing. And so, if indeed that was what Beijing was responding to, I think most Australians would think that was unreasonable. So my question for you is there more to the story? Is there a fuller explanation for why Beijing responded the way it did?
Well, thank you, James. It's well, before I come to the question, can I just say a few words about the statement you made? Actually, you made several points I think are very important. I'll touch on those points first. Well, thank you for your kindness for flagging some of the questions you're going to pose to me at this. But sorry for my bad memory. I don't remember those questions. But anyhow, this is occasion for mutual understanding. Yeah, it's to be informative, and it's not a test of IQ. You know, give me some surprise how quick you can react. Yeah, and if I'm prepared, I can share with you in a more comprehensive, more meaningful way. Yeah, that's the surprising anybody doesn't make much sense. Yeah, but I'm not surprised if you give me any new questions. As for the point that you made in your remark about China's changed, I would rather say that a lot of changes have happened in China in the past several decades, especially in the past 4 decades since the start of the reform and opening up in 1978. But the one thing it doesn't change is our policy, foreign policy, policy of peace development, and the policy of friendship towards Australia. This remains unchanged. As for the COVID-19 virus issue, it is our policy, it's our public policy that we should find out where the virus is coming from, where it's going. The purpose is to prevent such virus to happen again in the future. This is a public statement by our president publicly at the international forum. But it's one thing to talk about this, to find out the source, origin of the virus. And that's for the scientists to make their conclusion, to make studies. this is a scientific issue. But if somebody or certain country declares the COVID-19 virus as the so-called China virus, or they accuse China publicly, saying that the Chinese laboratory is inventing this new virus, and by mistake, it's leaked to the market and causing the spread of the pandemic in China and globally, that's absolutely unfounded. That's absolutely nonsense. This is absolutely something the Chinese people, 1.4 billion people, cannot accept. So if that happens, I think it's fair and reasonable for 1.4 billion Chinese people to be very angry about. As for the so-called punishment, I'm not sure is there any punishment from the part of the Chinese government. I know there's a very strong reaction among the Chinese public. If you search the internet at that period of time, it's very, very strong, very, very strong. And now your question is for more explanation. I think it's the current issue is that the question about the source in the original COVID-19 is scientific issue. But what happened then between the previous government of this country with China, with Chinese people, was something more complicated.
Right, okay, so I take from that the interpretation in Beijing was that this was not simply a scientific call for an independent international inquiry into COVID-19. The interpretation, whether correct or not, that was the interpretation, was a political attack was at play. That's my words. I won't pin those. That's my interpretation of your comment. Thank you. Look, let's now go to the end of 2020. November 18 to be precisely, the Sydney Morning Herald reported that the Chinese embassy, before your time of course, had arranged, quote, a deliberately leaked document, quote, that listed 14 disputes that, quote, appeared aimed at pressuring the Morrison government to reverse Australia's position on key policies, close quote. A coercive, threatening element was included in the story in the form of a quote from a Chinese government official who said, quote, China is angry. If you make China the enemy, China will be the enemy, close quote. And so that framing led to that 14-point list to become commonly known as the 14 demands. Now, what I've always found somewhat interesting about that list is, as a list of disputes, there's nothing particularly remarkable there. All of the things on that list is something that I could have told the Australian public were things that the Chinese government was annoyed by. Even the quote, if you make China the enemy, if you make China the enemy, China will be the enemy, is in one reading just a statement of the obvious, and in fact, it's actually a direct word-for-word quotation from Australia's former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer. So, a quote that he used himself. So to put my question bluntly, Mr. Ambassador, in Beijing's mind, does Canberra need to, for example, quote, this is on the list, reverse, quote, the decision banning Huawei technology and ZTE from the 5G network in order for broad ministerial dialogue to be reinstated and for trade to start flowing freely again? Fundamentally, I think the question is in Beijing's view, can an improved trajectory in Australia-China relations be charted through more cautious, respectful, careful diplomacy, or is it going to take policy concessions?
Well, first of all, about this, the so-called 14 points list. I don't have a list. I haven't ever seen a list of 14 points. And that happened before I came here as ambassador. But I would like to share with you that, according to what I've been told, is a informal discussion between the embassy staff with a media, and the embassy staff was upon request to explain what are the major concerns on the Chinese side, and then eventually the concerns were being reported in a twisted way as the so-called preconditions, as demands. And this is natural. That's natural. And well, there have been communication between China and Australia at various channels, a diplomatic channel, for example. If the Australian side expresses their concern on certain things to the Chinese side, I'm not going to categorize it as a precondition. It's just their concern. These concerns, and we're going to talk about this, as I said in my address, when we have differences, when we have disputes, it's a time for us to sit down and talk and exchange our views and to try to find out how we can minimize the differences and perhaps enlarge our common grounds. And twisted reports doesn't help. It's not constructive. For the Huawei issue, it's well, there've been views that well, it's this is the chicken and egg problem. Who's the first? Who started all this? And who's to be the one to take the first actions to improve? I think it's as a matter of fact. So as I learned about this, the previous government in this country made certain policies, took certain actions that virtually stopped the normal business cooperations and relations between Huawei and their counterparts in Australia, between ZTE with Australian counterparts, and also between some of the other Chinese companies with their counterparts in this country. That has caused heavy casualties, losses economically, and Huawei is almost virtually out of this market, at least out of this 5G market. And that perhaps could be described as the first shot. It has really damaged our normal business relations. As for the future, as I said, we are open for a joint efforts from Chinese side, from Australian side, by taking concrete actions to create an environment for the business to resume their normal relations. And you have to admit that when something has happened to Huawei, then other Chinese companies are surprised and they are concerned that this has happened to Huawei today. What about tomorrow? Is it happening to me, to my company? So some of the companies choose to move to other countries. Some of them choose to wait and see what will happen next. That's really causing the change of the atmosphere in our business relations.
Okay, so it sounds to me that the description of that list as the 14 demands, at least the message that's being communicated now, is to say that a list of 14 demands is not accurate, and nor do they represent preconditions for dialogue going forward. So I think that's a significant point to make as well. Okay, let's move on to another question. Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to share with you a general gripe, a general complaint I often hear from members of the Australian public. And it goes something like this. Some people will say that Australia and China have different systems, and the different ways that Australia and China operate give China an unfair advantage in relationship dealings. For example, when I invited you to this public address, I did not ask permission from the Australian Foreign Minister. I hope you don't mind, Vice-Chancellor, but I will share, I did not even ask the Vice-Chancellor for his permission either.
But with his support.
After the fact. The invitation was sent first.
I'm sure, with his support. That's important.
So the point is, there was no expectation from them or from me that I would need their permission. And so here we are. Now, some people will say that's not fair. The Chinese ambassador has been given a platform at an Australian university to put forward Beijing's views to the Australian public in an unfiltered way. That same opportunity is not available to Graham Fletcher, the Australian ambassador in Beijing. Another example, just a quick one. A few weeks ago, I signed an open letter with a number of other Australian academics calling for the new government in Canberra to take a more diplomatic approach to the management of China relations. Chinese state media outlets picked up on the letter and drew attention to it in their reporting. Again, I did not even ask my immediate supervisor's permission to sign that letter, let alone the Vice-Chancellor. But I find it almost impossible to imagine a similar letter from Chinese academics based at Chinese universities calling for Beijing to, for example, re-establish broad diplomatic dialogue with Australian counterparts, remove tariffs on Australian barley or wine, or free Australians detained in China. That difference can cause feelings of resentment amongst the Australian public and lead for calls for Canberra to insist on greater reciprocity. Can you understand those feelings and policy calls? And in your view, are they unreasonable?
Well, James, you posed one question, but before the question, you made a number of remarks. Again, can I just touch on those remarks before the question? Well, I think it's a fact, and you would agree that I come here at your invitation. And it's a platform for me to share my views. It's also a platform for me to listen to views, including some of the noises. And if, James, you say you would take back your invitation, I'm going to leave right now.
Please don't.
And there's nothing like a reciprocal kind of thing that, or it's a special kind of privilege. I say this privilege. My privilege to be here. But really, this is a platform for mutual communication instead of a one-sided communication. And secondly, for the Chinese intellectuals, whether they invite their, for example, Australian ambassador in China to a certain event, whether or not they would like to do that is their choice. Whether or not they would like to write a letter calling for something is their choice. But I personally believe that if they would like to write a collective letter, they're going to call for the Australian government to take different policies towards China, to look at China in a more objective way, and to help move the relationship back to the normal. If you look at the internet in China, the overall atmosphere in China is absolutely different from what you see here in this country. I think the atmosphere in both countries needs to be improved. That's a fact. Just like what I feel here in the past 5 months. If you look at the newspapers, television, and internet, well, there are so many news about China, sometimes on the top lines and the front page. But the news about China is always negative. It's negative, always negative, and nothing but negative. That's not a true picture about China. This is not a balanced approach, a balanced view about a country. And I understand there's a process that we should improve this atmosphere. And for Chinese atmosphere, I think it's also we need to improve by the joint efforts from both governments, so that the people from our two countries will have a better feeling about each other, as we have been in the past several decades. That's very important. You also touched upon the tariff and the sanctions. Can I just say,
sure.
People have been talking about the Chinese sanctions. If the sanctions, that's not fair, unreasonable, confounded. Should I say that this is an issue of complexity? It all started from some of the policies and actions taken by the previous government in this country, and there are reactions from the Chinese side. And these reactions could be categorized on several types, if I may. For example, the tariffs. The tariffs is something that the government has done. The tariffs have been increased because there were dumping concerns. And there were complaints from the Chinese businessmen who were dealing with the similar business about the dumping from Australia. So the government has to react to that. Now the case is already in WTO. And China and Australia, we are all members of WTO. Let's follow the rules and laws and to see what we can do in the WTO. A second type, perhaps, can I say, is a reaction from the Chinese public. When people are not happy, they don't buy your products. They go to different store, buy the similar products. And that happens in our relation with other countries as well. In the case of the recent situation, I think there are a lot of Chinese people who are not happy by some of the policies, actions, or rhetoric made by some people in this country. So there is a change of attitudes towards the relationship. There's a natural reaction from the public, from the Chinese people. And thirdly, third type perhaps is the business, as I mentioned. They become more cautious because they're worried they might be too risky to continue the trade relations. But there's no government official sanction measures per se that the Chinese government have taken.
One thing I'll say, you mentioned the WTO process. I mean, this is actually, I don't want to make light of it. Clearly, it is an area of dispute. But it's also, there is a positive angle to this in the fact that China and Australia both remain committed to the WTO process for resolving those disputes. And that's not always the case for other countries around the world. Okay, next question.
With respect, Ambassador,
we will have a chance. We will, sir, we will have a chance. We will have a chance. Let me, Ambassador, let me. We'll just wait for some.
And also,
time to go, sir. Let's go. Let's go. Thank
Hong
you.
Kongers and Tibetans were not allowed to voice their demands and voice their difficulties. That's why it's so positive for China. So, what's the point of your conversation? It's so one-sided. And the way you try to reduce differences is to suppress people.
Okay, thank you. And let me just say this again. You know, we welcome freedom of expression on this campus. That's why we're here today. Look, Mr. Ambassador, I could ask one more challenging question. I'm sorry to keep hitting you with these, but look, I think this is one I just have to ask for my own concerns and those of most Australians. Of course, there's plenty of Australians who are concerned about their livelihood as trade is disrupted for whatever reason. But I think if I had to nominate one area of most intense concern amongst Australians, it would be the circumstances that a number of individual Australians find themselves in China. This would include, Mr. Ambassador, UTS alumnus, Dr. Yang Hengjun, and Chung Lei, who, like me, is a University of Queensland graduate. It would also include folks in Australia's Uyghur diaspora, who have been saying for several years that they cannot reach friends and family members because they are caught up in detention facilities in Xinjiang. Or they don't want to contact them because they are worried they are being surveilled. Some of them themselves may have Australian permanent residency, if not citizenship. Let me give you one specific example. In March, then Foreign Minister Maurice Payne issued a statement regarding Chung Lei. This said that, quote, the Australian public respects the sovereignty of China's legal system, close quote, but then went on to list a number of concerns. The details of the charge not having been provided, the Australian ambassador being prevented from entering the court, Chung Lei having been cut off entirely from communicating with her family, including her 2 young children. Mr. Ambassador, can you understand why many Australians would think, sure, we appreciate that China has sovereignty over its legal system, but if that's the nature of the legal system in China, then it would be perfectly reasonable for the Australian government, for example, to not entertain an extradition treaty with China, or to warn Australians visiting China of the risk of arbitrary detention, and so on. I mean, surely, if a Chinese citizen was subjected to the same treatment in Australia, I imagine Beijing and the Chinese public would be up in arms. what would your message to those Australians be? Or if I could go one step further, is there any message of hope that you can give to those Australians who are worried sick right now about their loved ones?
Well, thanks, James, for the points you made and the question that you posed. Again, let me say that freedom of speech is different from absolute freedom. In this world, there's no such thing as absolute freedom. Freedom is freedom within rules and laws. Just like we're having a meeting today, we're having a public event, and those who are attending should respect the law and order. Keep quiet while we're speaking. Yeah. So those number of people who are coming again and again to disrupt the process, that's not expression of freedom of speech, in my views. So this should not be welcomed. I appreciate the point you make that this is a public event, but I do, well, with all my respect for you, obviously there are certain views that frankly speaking, I do disagree with. For the individual case of the Australians in China, first of all, there's been a very intense communication between China and Australia through diplomatic channels, both in Beijing and in Canberra. And on these cases, these are individual cases, and the Chinese relevant authorities are dealing with the cases according to the Chinese laws and regulations. It's a judicial kind of thing, and I think it's important for not only for the Chinese side but also the Australian side to respect the independent the jurisdiction, the legal process of China. And secondly, the basic rights of those individuals in China are provided, are being guaranteed according to our own laws. And some of the special measures have been taken actually to help them to get contact with the diplomats in China, either in Guangzhou or in Beijing, and also their families. Sometimes they may not get contacts as frequently as they wish. It's perhaps due to either the pandemic. The pandemic control measure policy in China is very, very strict, and that applies to everyone. And perhaps it's because of the nature of some of the cases. When a case involves something like national security, usually it's not conducted in a way that's open to the public. That happens in many other countries as well. As for the people in China, I think if you go to China, even during the pandemic, there are so many people from other countries, diplomats, media, tourists, businessmen, various sectors living in China, and they enjoy their life and work in China. So long as they respect the rules and laws, there's no need for them to worry. As for the Xinjiang you mentioned, it's virtually it's not a question of well, I think you're talking about individual cases, but I don't know which particular case you're talking about. I don't have the details from you, but I would like to say that overall speaking, the question of Xinjiang is not a question of the so-called human rights or freedom or whatsoever. It's a question of national unity or separatism, peace or order or terrorism. It's a serious challenge to China's stability, national integrity, and necessary measures have been taken in the interest of both the people in Xinjiang and also the people in China. I think there's a difference. There's a difference here. I noticed there are a number of people who are here. I don't know whether these guys are they Chinese? They're holding Chinese citizens' passports, or are they naturalized Australians? If you're Australians, you're loyal to the Australian government. And but whether you're Chinese or Australians, I think, as mentioned in my earlier speech, that sovereignty, territorial integrity, domestic affairs should be respected. Just like I've been respecting domestic affairs and sovereignty of this nation. Yeah, I've been keeping quiet during the federal election. And I'm not going to comment, even today, on the domestic affairs of Australia. And I absolutely support the territorial integrity of Australia. Well, it's not a good example, but Tasmania is part of Australia. No one should ever challenge that. If something happens, somebody is not happy with the government, it's individual cases, and it's not a question of people should separate this from a overall picture of a nation.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We would, I think, all be thrilled if in the not too distant future it were possible to welcome those Australians home. I know it wasn't so long ago that 2 Canadian citizens were detained in China and they are now back in Canada. I think we'd all be thrilled if that was possible in the case of Yang Yingjun and Cheng Wei as well. Mr. Ambassador, I might just go to a final question. Unfortunately, our time is shorter than I had hoped because of some of the disruption we had, which is a bit of a tragedy in itself. Mr. Ambassador, can I wrap up with this question? This December is the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between Australia and the People's Republic of China. Now, reflecting on that, on one hand, the depth and breadth of those ties are truly extraordinary. Who could have imagined the extent of people-to-people ties we would have today? Trade ties, of course. And yet, fears about the state and trajectory of bilateral relations, I think, are at an all-time high. How optimistic are you? I'm not forcing optimism on you, it's a question. How optimistic are you? And what specific measures can you assure our audience today that your embassy in Canberra and the Foreign Ministry in Beijing will be advocating for within the Chinese government to ensure that that 50th anniversary can be celebrated?
Well, this year really marks a very important year for bilateral relations. It's the 50th anniversary of the diplomatic ties, and I think personally it's important for us to celebrate in a certain way. And celebration is not for the sake of celebrations, but celebration is an opportunity for us to think about the past. By taking stock of the past, we can perhaps draw some experiences, and maybe even lessons, from the past, so that we can develop our bilateral relations in the future in a better way, future decade or even future 50 years. And the actual date is December 21st, and we still have time. And I understand there's a new government in Canberra, and there's a process for them to settle down, to make up their policies, about making up their arrangement in their personals, like senior ministers or secretaries, and there's a process for them to think about some of the other specific issues. And the Chinese side is ready to discuss and compare notes with their Australian colleagues in the Labour government as to what we can do together to jointly celebrate such an important event. I think it's meaningful. We're having some problems today. It doesn't mean we have to negate the whole past 50 years. There are a lot of successful stories in so many areas, a lot of areas where we successfully be cooperating with each other, and it's to the benefit of both sides. As I mentioned in my speech, it's good for both sides. It's not a one-sided kind of relationship. It's good for both sides. So I think, personally, I'm still optimistic.
And I'll take that as a commitment that there will be a lot of hard work in the Chinese embassy from now until December to make that anniversary a success. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for accepting our invitation to join us in dialogue in today's public event and engage in good faith. It's a rarity for the Australian public to have this opportunity, and at a time of many challenges in the bilateral relationship, it is, I think, of tremendous value for the Australian public to be able to hear your thoughts directly. Members of our audience, thank you for coming today. I hope you found the discussion informative, and please join me in thanking the Ambassador to the People's Republic of China, His Excellency Mr. Xiao Qian. Thank you.
Straight away, sir. Straight away, go now. If you want to say stuff like that, you're out of here. Let's go. Out. No questions. Out. Go.
Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your understanding. It's a... Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh，